Robin Gow, and he is a poet, and he grew up in Allentown, Pennsylvania. His queer family consists of his two pugs, Eddie and Gertie, and his partner, best friend, and fabulous queer and trans community. In addition to writing poetry, that's right, in addition, Cal also writes young adult woohoo and middle grade books. It is the author of YA novels in verse, A Million Quiet Revolutions, and Ode to My First Car that came out this year, and with FSG Books for young readers, and Dear Mothman with Adams Books. And that is what we're going to be discussing today. And that is a book about a moving middle grade novel in verse about a young trans boy dealing with the loss of his friend by writing to his favorite cryptid, Mothman. So we're looking forward to hearing more about that. And we have Brittany Williams. This is such a talented woman here. If you don't know already, Miss Williams is an actress, writer, and I said this is from her page, Nerd of Many Phantoms. She holds a BFA in musical theater from Howard University.
HU?
All right, what was I going to say? Go ahead, say it, Brittany.
HU, you know.
Okay. I'm not from Howard, so I didn't feel like I could say that, but you got it, girl.
You good.
And an MA in classical acting from the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. Brittany has performed across three continents, including a year spent as the principal vocalist at Hong Kong Disneyland. And her writing has been featured on BlackNerdProblems.com, Tour.com, and in the Independent, The Gambit, Fireside Magazine, and in the Star Wars anthology From a Certain Point of View, The Empire Strikes Back. Her first novel, That Self-Same Metal, a YA historical fantasy set in William Shakespeare's London, released this April. You can find her on Twitter and Instagram at BrittanyActs and at BrittanyNWilliams.com. Without further ado, I'm going to step aside and let these lights shine. We have Robin and Brittany. Take it away.
Thanks so much, y'all. I sound impressive with that bio. Dang.
I think that might be one of the best intros I've ever had.
Right. Thank you. All right. So I guess we got a little bit about your book. So I'm gonna put you on the spot because I started talking first. Can you just give us a real quick, your elevator pitch of the book?
Totally.
Yeah.
So Dear Mothman is a story of a young trans boy named Noah, who's processing the death of his best friend, Lewis. They were the only other trans kids in school together, and he's doing this by writing to this monster that Lewis was obsessed with. The monster is Mothman. You can kind of see a version of Mothman on the cover. And so he's writing to Mothman to try to see if he can find a connection with Lewis, and also to try to prove if Mothman's real. And that leads on a whole adventure. They go into the woods to try to find Mothman, him and his new little crew of friends. Yeah.
That's good. I love that.
Yeah. I'd love to hear more about your book, too.
Yeah. All right. I'll give you my elevator pitch. So That Self-Same Metal follows 16-year-old Joan Sands. She has the magical ability to manipulate metal, and she only wants to use that power to build swords and choreograph fights for William Shakespeare's acting company. But when malevolent fae invade London, she finds that she is one of the few people who can protect the city. So that's the short of it. There's much more going on, but that's the quick version.
That's fabulous.
Yes, thank you. Oh, thank you, son.
Do we want to both do a short reading?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can go first since I put you on the spot earlier. All right, here we go. Burbage's broad laugh echoed through the empty playhouse, and Shakespeare grinned at her as they moved to their starting positions. Go half speed this first time. Joan placed her sword at her feet and girded up her skirt, tying the loose fabric at either side of her waist on the chance that she'd need to demonstrate some moves. You can never be sure with these two. But Joan kept that to herself. She snatched up Bia again and stepped toward the back of the stage, digging the sword's point into the wood floor. She laid her hands across the hilt. To give you a chance to fix yourselves before I do it for you. Both men snorted and squared off with each other. They held gazes for a long moment, doing nothing, the air between them seeming to suddenly spark with dangerous energy. Joan frowned. You can begin. Don't you want to get to the alehouse? "Come on, sir," Burbage said. "Come, my lord," Shakespeare replied. He swung for Burbage's neck, an opening move that Joan did not remember teaching them. Burbage leaned back, the blow whistling through the air where his neck had been, before striking out with his own sword. Shakespeare spun out of the way a second too late. Joan saw the split in his sleeve slowly turning red with blood. "One," Burbage said. What was happening? "Hold," she shouted. "None of this is what I taught you." Burbage stabbed his sword at Shakespeare. Joan watched it catch the taller man along the stomach, ripping his shirt, but not splitting the skin. "Judgment," Burbage shouted, speaking Hamlet's lines even as the two men fought in earnest. "Hold," she yelled. "Both of you, hold!" Shakespeare ripped his blade along Burbage's arm. More blood drawn. That was enough. Joan lifted Bia and ran toward the two men. She slipped between them, knocking their swords away with two heavy blows. "What's the matter with you? Hold means stop, or have you forgotten?" Burbage stumbled a bit, then stared straight at Joan. She tensed. His eyes shone like they had during the show. Held a deadly glint he'd never aimed at her before today. She glanced over at Shakespeare and saw a matching sharpness in his gaze. So it hadn't been Bia pushing them after all. Joan shifted her stance as they each took a step toward her. "Let's say that's enough for today." Burbage charged forward, rushing into her space before she was ready. Joan dropped to one knee as his blade sliced the air over her head. She pivoted, swinging her blade up to parry his blow. The strength of it rattled her bones and sent her tumbling backward. Shakespeare peered above her as she hit the stage, his sword raised over his head. She threw herself to the side as the blow rang against the stage behind her. "God's crown!" She stumbled to her feet, holding her sword out in front of herself and trying to keep both men in sight. "I said stop!" Thank you.
I know. I know I said we would both read, but I have a question for you after
Oh, yeah,
that.
absolutely. Have at it.
How did you go about making a character of Shakespeare? Because so often we hear about him in the distance of these stories that are so typical, and I love seeing him in action.
Right. So I knew that I wanted to have, if I was going to have a story with Faye, I wanted to have them perform Midsummer Night's Dream. And I was like, who better to have perform it than Shakespeare's actual, acting company? And as I was writing it, he just kind of, the way that I wrote him kept demanding a larger and larger part. So, he was just like a cameo at first, and then it was just all right, but let me just put him in one more scene. Okay, but let me just give him a little bit more. Okay, let me just give him a little bit more. And so he just kind of crept into more and more of the story. And I wanted to capture, not this academic Shakespeare that we've been told existed, who was this learned man of letters who we all should respect and never sully his good name. I wanted to capture the guy who wrote raunchy plays and raunchy poetry and hung out with a bunch of other actors. And that guy, who I think is probably closer to the true guy, was really, really fun to write.
Yeah, that's part of why I asked, is because I love how it feels like how I would imagine the real Shakespeare to be. Because I always resonate with Shakespeare because, he's a bisexual icon. He's amazing.
Right. A bisexual poet.
Yes.
Come on.
I bet he was very entertaining. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so too. And you can't write such fun stuff and such fun lines and not be at least a somewhat exciting person.
Yeah, totally. A character.
And everybody back then, they couldn't drink. There was no clear water or clean water to drink, so they drank watered down ale. So you think about all these dudes were half drunk. Everybody was half drunk. It had to be, they had to be having a good time.
They definitely did.
All right, I will let you read now.
All right, I have more questions, but I'll do my thing. I'm so much more invested in talking to you about your book.
I'm gonna get you back. Don't worry, I'm gonna get you back.
Great. So the novel is told in poems, which is the one thing I didn't introduce at first. It's told in poems and journal entry kind of things. So I'm gonna read from the beginning of the book because it comes in little pieces. So if I move anywhere else in the middle, I've always given something away. So it starts off with a school report, and it says partners activity. A report on a mythical creature for Mrs. Allman's 6th grade class. The Mothman by Lewis Hugh and Noah Romano. Name, Mothman. Location, first seen in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, but seen all over the United States. Physical description, He is 8 or 9 feet tall. He has black feathers and wings like a moth, glowing red eyes. About. Mothman is a cryptid, which is different from a mythical creature because mythical creatures are made up, but cryptids are real. They're just very hard to see. They're good at hiding, and only a few people can see them. Some people think cryptids aren't real. We chose Mothman for this project because more people think he's a mythical creature than not. We know he's real, though, because there's a whole lot of legends and stories about Mothman, and he's still alive, so there's more every year. The woods around here are perfect for him to live in, with lots of places to hide. We're going to see him one day, and then we're going to tell people stories about him. And then each poem kind of starts with, Dear Mothman. Dear Mothman, I pretended to believe in you for Lewis. I am hoping, though, that maybe he was right. That he really did see you once on that sleepover in November when frigid wind howled through the forest and everything was bare. He pointed out my window saying, Look, Noah, look, do you see him? I didn't see you, but I fibbed and said, I think I do. Lewis has been gone for 3 months now, but sometimes I still don't believe it's real. Tonight, I walked outside in the chilly March rain. If Lewis were here, he would have told me I was so weird for not wearing a jacket. Mothman, do you wear a jacket? Do you ever get cold? If you get cold, you aren't like me. Do you wear a chest binder or you bind with great broad leaves from the deep of the forest? Lewis was sure you were queer like us. If you're not, that's okay too. I just want to know you're there. I'm going to lay my journal at the foot of this tree tonight for you to read my letter. Lewis always said, you love to come out during thunderstorms. And tonight is the first storm of spring. If I'm going to find you for my science fair project, this is my chance. The fair is coming up soon, and I don't have any other ideas. All I can think of anymore is Lewis. Lewis loved to see veins of light pulse across the night sky. He was never afraid. I am not like him. I am afraid of lightning and thunder and the dark woods and even a little bit of the thought that you could be real. But still, I'm writing in my journal, Dear Mothman, on the cover, so you'll know it's for you. And I'll read one more poem. This poem is titled Morning. Before Mom and Dad get up, I rush outside in my pajamas to get the journal. My feet get soaked by the morning dew. Everything smells green. I find the journal open. To my letter for Mothman, my pulse quickens. I think it must have been the breeze or maybe a squirrel that opened the journal, but what if it wasn't? I'm shaking the thought away. After all, how would Mothman find my journal on the first night I left a note for him, unless he was also looking for me? The thought creeps me out a little. I collect the books still damp from dew and rain and dash inside. I'm thinking maybe I'll leave one more letter.
Yes, break our hearts from page, what, 2?
Yes.
Love that. So why Mothman as opposed to any other cryptid?
That's a great question. I think it's just because the LGBTQ plus community has like such a cult following around Mothman. There's like Mothman bumper stickers, Mothman plushies. And I think the thing that people gravitate towards Mothman specifically is that to me, he feels like a very sympathetic creature. Like, the stories they're never of him, like, harming people.
Yeah.
He usually comes to warn people something bad is going to happen.
Okay, yeah.
So I think that there's, like, and I write about this a little bit in the book of, like, this feeling, like, misunderstood or outside in some way. And I think that makes queer people connect to Mothman.
Yeah.
And then I love him.
Right.
So part of it's a little bit selfish that I love Mothman. But I do think that there's that, like, direct connection with the community.
Yeah. It would have been a bit different if it was like, Dear Jersey Devil, please don't murder me.
Yeah, the Jersey Devil's a little scary.
Right?
Yeah.
And I love how with the very first, from the very first page, you capture the way kids write essays so beautifully.
Oh, thanks.
And was it difficult to navigate, especially because you're writing in verse in first person and through these poems, to navigate to navigate death in a way that like middle grade kids could handle?
That's a really great question. I think that poetry lends itself to being able to hold the weight of something that's really heavy. And I actually think that the poems helped because it's kind of like pieces of emotion.
Yeah.
And you can move through, because, Noah has moments of like really great joy in the book.
Yeah.
And I think that poems, I found them to be like a good capsule for that.
Yeah.
And I tend to gravitate towards poems for telling stories because my stories tend to be around something that's like, like emotionally kind of hard to process sometimes for
Yeah.
youth audiences. And so I tend to use that for that advantage in that like having poems can make you feel immersed in the emotion of that character. Oh no, jellyfish down. What I was thinking when I was listening to you read.
No, take your time. Take your time. We can pause for fashion.
I guess I was curious. So you have like a formal background in acting and
Yes.
such. And I'm sure people ask you this all the time, but how much did your own background inform your characters or your desire to write this story?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I've been a Shakespeare nerd since I was in elementary school.
Amazing.
I used to watch Shakespeare the Animated Tales on HBO on Saturday mornings, and that like got me way into it. And when I was 10 years old, I was in my first school play, and I was like, all right, yes, I want to be an actor. Like, that's what I want to be. And I want to do Shakespeare. And so that kind of drove every decision I'd made since then. And really, when I was writing this book, I ended up writing to my 16-year-old self. So that was like me who wanted to perform Shakespeare, who went to school with walking pneumonia because I had to go on the field trip to see The Winter's Tale at Baltimore Center Stage. Like that kid, I was like, yes, I'm gonna write to that kid. Right, committed. I'm like, we in this, we down, like 10 toes down for Shakespeare, even when I'm coughing up a lung.
No.
And basically, when you perform Shakespeare, there are all these layers of history you have to like retain in order to make these 400-plus-year-old plays understandable for a contemporary audience. So you have to understand like the time in which the play is set. So like A Midsummer Night's Dream is kind of set very loosely somewhere around like 1200 BC in Athens. So you have to have like a basic understanding of what that means and what general life was like then. Then you need to understand what life was like in 1595, 1596 when the play was written. So you have to have this whole understanding of like Shakespeare and the world that the audience was, living in. And so you can understand these like weird archaic jokes.
Yeah.
And then you need to understand the contemporary world so that you can make these kind of translations and leaps so that your audience isn't just sitting there like glazed over, just being like, wow, what beautiful poetry. I wish I understood what was happening. And so I had all of that, like Shakespeare's life and times knowledge rolling around in my head. So when I sat down to write, I had already done a bunch of the research into the time period. I also am trained in stage combat, so sword fighting, a bunch of different like weapons and stuff. So that definitely went into there. And I was like, if I'm gonna write like somebody hanging out with William Shakespeare, I'm gonna write a sword master. Like I'm gonna have a bunch of sword fights. So I threw that in there with Joan. And they actually performed some of the plays within this. So, casting them, having them speak the lines and pulling those out. This book is it's just basically me. It's all of the things I love in a single book. And it's just kind of reaching back to that 16-year-old kid who loved this thing, but also had people making her feel like she didn't belong in loving this thing, and who was like, I like boys. No, it's not. It's not weird that I really, really want to be this girl's friend. I just want to be her friend, right? I'm not like, it's not a weird thing. And it's like, no, baby, you're bisexual. It's okay. Yeah. So yeah, just trying to write something for that kid and any kids like her, so that there are some answers to those questions that come up.
Definitely. It's interesting because I also feel like I have a similar impulse when I'm writing a book, which is like trying to write something I would have needed as a young person. And yeah, I feel like digging into that can be kind of hard sometimes because I've often felt like I wish I could I don't know, give my younger self actually
Yeah.
this book. But then you come around and you get to share it with people, and, and then people react to it. And
and
then
it's kind of like that, all the therapists are like, reparent yourself. So you can, like I say, I wrote this for like the past 16-year-old me, but that me is still in there. And so there were, like in writing this, it kind of excavated some of those issues and stuff, and I was able to let some stuff go and embrace some stuff that I maybe forgot about. And I'm sure it was probably the same way for you writing this one.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I always feel like some people have asked me like before, like what made me start writing towards youth, because I used to write like, I say like adult poetry, but that makes it sound like spicy. But it's not. It's just poetry.
Right.
And I always say that like writing for an adult audience always felt different, and writing for youth, it felt very healing, because you get to really like live and experience those things that you might not have had space for. And it really sounds like that's a space you've carved out in this book. It's such a great adventure. Like it makes me feel powerful.
Yes, listen, that's what I want. That's exactly what I want. When you are using poetry to encapsulate an entire novel, how is that? I don't know. I don't write poetry. I'm not good at it. So I'm completely baffled by y'all who write books in verse. So how is that different from maybe writing like a poetry collection or just writing like one-offs? And how do you navigate telling an entire narrative through these small like slices of life?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what I usually find myself doing, for me, like my characters are always like the thing that I resonate or like grab onto most. So usually my first draft is more of like an emotional journey, like how their emotions shift, and each poem kind of showing that. And then I have to go back and I have to say, this is supposed to be a novel. I have to have a plot. and then from there I start to build out like the events that surround that character's emotions that they lead through. And then I go back again and I build out the world. So I start like character, plot, and then the world around them, because in all of my verse novels, I've always had this impulse that I forget to do describe what the forest looks like, or I'm in the story. I forget that other people can't see.
Right. Listen, same. I understand that struggle.
Yeah. And so like it kind of comes together in layers like that. I will say that it is such a different thing to write a novel in poems than like a collection, because a collection, like I usually write them all and then I spread them all out on the floor and I like try to figure out which ones go together. But this has to really like kind of be cohesive. It's a very interesting process. I will say it's like the most natural way that I tell stories. So like sometimes I'm like, I don't know if I had a choice. Like it just came out like this. But I do love it, and I hope that sometimes that like verse novels can open up poetry for people.
Yeah.
I think that in like schools, there's often like a very narrow, like they want you to decipher a poem and if you don't understand it at first, like, I don't know, people make you feel like you're not adequate or something.
Right.
And I want youth to just like enjoy and experience poems and have it not be like, oh, you're not smart for not, I don't know, instantly getting this 200-year-old poem.
Right. Yeah, I think back about the one that sprang to mind is this one poem called Trois Corbies.
Interesting.
Right. It's like two crows.
Oh, okay.
Just talking. Right, exactly. Or how teachers always hit you with there is one single meaning to a poem, when that's never true.
Yeah, that's what I feel like. Because for a long time, that's what I thought too, is that like, and then it impacts the way you write, because you start writing like, I have to write a puzzle box.
Yes. Or or feeling like you've done something incorrect if the theme that you had in mind isn't what other people get.
Definitely.
Or like you think you have to automatically build in, like you said, this puzzle box of layers to everything, when really your readers, you just write the thing and your readers discover layers. They bring themselves to it, just
100%.
like you bring yourself to the writing.
Yeah, that's how I feel, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. I got right. No. So do you outline? I know the stereotypical writer question. Do you? I'm really fascinated with this, like with books in verse, and I've never gotten to ask anybody about books in verse.
No, I'm happy to
So
talk
do you?
about it.
Is it like? Do you outline? Do you just? I know you do it in layers, but
I will tell you, like, no matter whether I'm drafting prose or verse, I go about it in a very horrific way in that I don't have an outline. I just like write and I have an ending in mind, because what I've found is if I outline it, I'm bored by it and I won't like stay engaged, and I'll be like, well, I've already finished the story in my head, so I'm not going to write it. I will say that like it makes revision a nightmare because I'm like trying to connect this piece of something I dropped in like the second chapter, and I'm like, that doesn't matter.
Right.
Either I have to cut it, or it's definitely hard, but it's just like how I draft. I'm curious, how do you go about?
I thought I didn't outline, and then my husband told me I did. I was like, I don't outline. I just write like very descriptive chapter titles for what I'm planning on writing. But that's not an outline. It's not like A, B, C, D, you know, all that stuff like we did in school. And he was like, no, that's an outline. And I'm like, oh, well, shoot. I guess I do outline. But I outline, and then I deviate sometimes very heavily from that outline, and then but like you, I write with like an ending in mind and maybe like a scene or two in the middle that I want to capture. So this book, I did a bunch of rounds of edits with like my agent and then my editor. And then with the sequel, I went from 6 drafts of the first book to 3 of the second book. So I'm like,
nice.
all right, we're cutting it in half, like we making it. And like you, description doesn't come easily to me because I'm approaching all of this like as an actor. I'm like, dialogue, bet, I got it. Fights, I'm good. Like actions and like moving people around in space, great. Describing that space, not so much, because you don't worry about that as an actor. Like we don't, right? Somebody else is building the set. Like I don't have to like know what the space looks like. I'm just gonna be there, and I just have to move around it. So yeah, I end up having to like go back and in my later drafts have to add in like description, because I have that, you know, the dreaded white room. Yeah. Where like everything's happening in a white room. My editor's like, where are we? What's happening? Who else is here? I'm like, girl, don't you know? It's like, we're all here, aren't we?
The scene.
Right? We're in here. We're in this space. And it's like, as you write, do you see it as like a movie happening in your head, or?
I definitely think I do. Yeah. I love, ever since I was little, even before I like wrote, I would draw like storyboard panels for books.
Love that.
So I guess that's how I do outline, is I do think of things visually.
Yeah.
So I'll think of, things usually in pictures.
Okay.
But now I'm too lazy to draw all the drawings, so they're just in my head.
It's like, but that's just, it's not, I don't think it's lazy, because like as an adult, like we have all these like adult things taking up our time, so it's just like, for efficiency's sake, you skip the paper part and you just jump right into writing.
Yeah, definitely. As you were talking, I had another question for you. That in your scene, you showed a lot of like action and such.
Yeah.
And I was curious how you actually, doing those, as a person who does acting and does sword fighting and stuff, how does that impact like writing action scenes? Because I felt like the timing felt so natural, and I was like, maybe that having actually done it helps inform that timing.
No, it absolutely does. And I have a practice rapier that I keep in my office. Oh, so fun. I'll actually like go through some of the moves to make sure they make sense. But with my fight scenes, I want my readers to feel the rhythm and the breath of it. So I use that with like varying sentence lengths and stuff. And I try to get like the most active words possible, and just like give a moment to like catch our breath with the character. Like I want you to breathe through the scene with us. All of that. And I remember my teacher, she emphasized that fights never last very long, because either somebody like taps out or you get tired, because it's just, it's a lot. And I also approach all of my fights as an opportunity to like, how does this further the plot? How does this specific character in this current emotional state, with their whatever level of expertise, how do they approach this fight? How do they navigate through this fight? And also making sure that I acknowledge that injuries hurt both physically and mentally.
Nice, yeah.
And letting that shift happen within the characters. And I've always loved fight scenes. I love watching them in movies and stuff because, as violent as they get in movies, as violent as they get on stage, ultimately everybody's okay. Like,
Yeah,
they have to be.
definitely.
The union says you have to be okay. Because way back in the day with all those old cowboy movies, they were using like live ammunition and firing at each other. Yes, that's why. That is why we have SAG-AFTRA. That's why we have the union now, because they would be dodging. Bless you. They would hire sharpshooters to shoot real bullets at the actors.
That's wild.
Yes, so it was very dangerous then. So but now it's all safe. Like, it's just like blanks. You know not to aim your gun at anybody. Like, sword stuff, especially on camera, you can be like 10 feet away from the other person, but because of where the camera is placed, it looks very dangerous. So all of that, and like knowing what I know what makes me go and I try to put those moments into fights and stuff. And yeah, I do lean a bit into the gore in the book. I surprised myself. I was like, oh wow, that's a lot. That like early on, there's a guy who's eaten alive by he thinks they're just like regular prostitutes, but they're actually hags. So he's just having a good time while they just rip his arms off and stuff. Right. And I was like, where did that come from? I don't like horror movies. But right. No. And it comes out of nowhere. But it's like, this is where we are. Y'all ready? You strapped in? It's only going downhill from here. Yeah, it's just, I like to capture that rhythm, and the only way you can do it when you're writing is through the length and pacing of your sentences.
That's amazing. Yeah, and it comes through so clearly.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. That's my favorite scene to read, and the fight just goes on from there. And so she's like in the middle of this three-way fight with two people who are trying to kill each other and her, as she's trying not to kill or hurt either of them. And that's just the worst place you want to be. Like, with two people who aren't going to pull their punches, and you have to pull all of yours and figure out how to incapacitate them without incapacitating them.
Yeah.
So,
and that speaks to what you're talking about like the fight being a space of navigating emotions. Navigating that conflict that's occurring in other spaces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it has to happen for a reason. And sometimes that reason is just because it's fun.
Yeah.
But you have to put something else on there, because books have a finite amount of space.
Yeah, definitely. So
we always end up cutting a bunch of stuff that we loved, and 100%. So you got to make it matter.
100%. Do you find that I've found a lot of authors either like draft big and cut down, or draft small and build out? It's sounding like you might be the
no.
down. No, okay.
I am small and I grow. So the first draft of this was 34,000 words. Okay. And now it's like 78. So the first draft was half the size of this. And it was like, it wasn't even a novella, because a novella is like 40,000 words. I was like, good God, girl, what are you doing? So yeah, I always draft up, and even with my short stories, I end up like growing a bit, and it's partially because of that description thing. So
that makes sense.
Yeah, but and I did better with book two. Book two, the first draft was like 54,000, and so it's it's expanding from there. I also don't put any like slow moments in my books. We just kind of power through in the first draft, so it's like, all right, we just racing through. You don't get a break. You don't get to have a conversation. We just going through to the end. But it's that like, I want to tell the story.
Yeah,
I need to tell myself the story first,
totally.
And then we can figure the rest out. Do you edit up or edit down?
That's a great question. I do both at the same time, because I include a lot of stuff in my first draft that I think is, like you're saying, like telling yourself the story, or like stuff that's just like character development.
Yeah.
Like, my character needed to say this poem. Nobody else needs to read it because it's like boring. But like, having that space for them to have said it helps me understand how they would respond in another scenario. So I think that I definitely do that for myself. But like I said, in both directions, because I'm cutting out that, and then also
you always have to cut. Yeah. You can't. the first draft, all the first draft has to do is exist, and that existence can be very rough sometimes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So like you always end up, even with my little slim 34,000 word girl, my skin tea girl, I ended up cutting a bunch of stuff and editing up. Like for example, my old the original chapter 1 is now chapter 4 in the book. So like a bunch got added on to the beginning. And it, it's a better book for it, I cut the old ending. The old ending did not work. I miss her. She was lovely, but it did not. Y'all would have been mad at me. Y'all would have been like, this girl, what? So the new ending is way better. But yeah, should we open it up for questions or, yeah. Okay. Is that,
yeah, I'm good.
All right. Y'all got any questions? Yes. Oh, here we go. Right here in the front. Right up.
We go way back.
Hey.
So the question I was going to ask, you just touched on it a bit, and it was really going to be, after you've done the editing and how do you choose or decide how you're going to start the story? Like, what is going to be that chapter 1, or what is going to be, I love that opening snippet that you had, right? And then you go into the first poem, and it does so much about setting the background, history about the character, the motivation, just so effectively done. And the chapter 1, I get so much of Joan's character and like personality from that opening. So I'm just so curious, how generally do you decide it as authors, and how did you decide them for these works?
Okay. Yeah. So for me, I take this advice from my husband Daniel. You want to enter the book and enter scenes in general at the last possible moment and leave as soon as possible. So I wanted to find when is the last moment we could, or like the latest time we could pop into Joan's life, and get into, like, dive into her story, understand as much as possible about her, orient everybody in the world. Because if I say like London 1605, nobody except like 4 of us, like me and the people at the Folger, know what that means. Like, that's it. And they're not my target audience. They are, but they're not the target audience. So I just wanted to get as much information in as quickly as possible. I'm not writing a history text, so I didn't want it to be like dry and boring. And I like to end chapter 1 with the inciting incident, so like, okay, we're on our way. Like, we're in it to win it. And ultimately, that chapter came later on in the process, maybe around like my 3rd or 4th draft. I remember because I wrote it and I was like, this is it. This is it. And I sent it to Tracy Dion and I was like, girl, read this. Isn't it good? Because she had read the 2nd draft and she was like, this is good, but I think we could do better. And I was like, yes, I can. And I sent it to her because I was so excited. I was like, this is it. And she was like, yeah, this is it. And I think the hardest part for me is finding that very first line and making it sing. So yeah, sometimes that's the last thing you write or one of the last things you get to, but I'm not upset because I didn't lock in the best first chapter immediately. So that's for me. I talk a lot, sorry.
No, it's amazing to hear. For me, I feel like for the last few books, it's been the same thing that I started writing has been my first thing. Like, and the way I do that is that, like, I always feel like all the seeds for the story need to live in the first poem or the first page, even if, like, it's not totally apparent to the reader at first. Like, I feel like I have to sow everything that I want to, like, come into fruition. And so that's usually what I'm thinking of. That's most of what I have. I wish I had. Sometimes people ask me wonderful craft questions, and I'm like, I don't know. I just do it.
Look, that's a flex. Like, it just comes out. Like, I love that. Right? I just, the words just fall out of me. No, but I love, like, that first essay and, like, the just the way you capture the repetitive way kids write when they have to write academic essays because they've barely done any research.
Yes, and
but the passion is there. Yes, it's just so beautiful. And then to lead right into that first poem where we find out that like the kids who wrote that probably like they've suffered this great loss and everything. It's just so, it's such a pivot, but it really sets up the book in such a beautiful way.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
I have a question as a educator for both of you. What is the one thing that you think is most important from the works that you're presenting today? A takeaway that you would like students like my student Lizzie to have here? Because you don't write you write to express yourselves, but you also write from hearing you from the heart, and you want a message, and I'm assuming that message is positive. So I would love to know what you want the students to take away from your wonderful works.
I guess, it's really hard to have one message, but I think, like, something in the lines of, like, embracing even the things that, like, the world will call you monstrous for, or, like, even when you're misunderstood, like, there are spaces to find yourself. I, like, always gravitated towards monster stories growing up. I didn't have, like, a lot of... I cannot think of a single, like, LGBTQ character until, like, high school, and then that was, like, Glee, which was not a book. And that... Oof. Yeah. and I didn't resonate with the characters, so, like, I still didn't feel like I had someone. But as a kid, like, I gravitated towards anything that was, like, strange, and monsters often occupy a space of, like, what is demonized or people are afraid of. And so I guess, like, embracing those strange parts of yourself and not making it something where you have to fit in, but more like just embracing the strangeness. Yeah.
I know for me with this book, what I wanted to do most strongly was to firmly and aggressively place Black people and people of color within this time period in a way that's accurate, but that we don't get in school. And I also wanted to place queer people very aggressively and intentionally in this time period as well, so that because there's this idea that we were invented in the 90s or something, and Black people were invented to, like, for slavery and stuff. So I just wanted to bring the truth that I had to learn later in life to kids who could really use learning that earlier. And especially in this time when we have so many people trying to erase Black history, trying to erase queer history, queer existence, Black existence. I just wanted to give teens and kids a very firm, well-researched example, or just show them that, like, no, we have always been here. We will always be here. People always try to erase us. It never works. And this is us. We were here. Don't listen to the lies. Any other questions? Questions, comments, concerns? Oh, yep, one in the front. Hey.
I kind of have, like, two questions. First,
Sure.
I wanted to ask you guys, like, what is your favorite part of being an author now, since you guys are, like, published? And then also kind of, like, talking about how easy or maybe how strenuous maybe the query process would have been, like, getting people to believe in your stories and in your books.
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
My favorite thing is definitely getting to go to schools and, like, talk to kids. It really, like this Wednesday I went to, like, a GSA to talk about the book, and it just is amazing. And you get to see, like, what you intended come to fruition. Like, a kid was like, this literally is exactly how I feel about everything. And I hadn't felt, I don't know, a story that put words to my experience. And I feel lucky that that's something someone had resonated with. So that just really makes everything great. Querying process was very difficult, specifically too, just from my experience for verse. There's not a lot of agents that will represent verse. And I'm always in the mindset of, like, I would like to challenge everyone to open their hearts to poetry. Like, poetry's great. there are so many like groundbreaking verse novels right now. Like, I can list a million of them, but I had a really hard time finding someone who was interested both in YA and in verse. And then trying to find someone who had also worked with queer clients before, because I was wary. Publishing overall is like not always great, just as a general oversweeping generalization. And I was like, I wanted an agent who like I felt like would be in my corner. So it was hard, and a lot of people just replied like, "We don't read poetry," and I was like, "Okay, thank you, goodbye." But I'm lucky in that I landed in a publishing path and such. Yeah.
Yeah, I think mine is also similar. Like, I love having, like, sharing the book with people, talking about it with people, having people say that this thing that is so personal to me also feels personal to them, and touch them, and like having the most random folks be like, "Oh my God, I love the book." Like, the social media director at the Folger was like, "Oh my God, I love the book." And he's just this like straight white dude. So it's like, yes, bro, come on, welcome. So that's been really fun. And, the book is still pretty new. It's only been out for 3 weeks. So as more and more people read it and get their hands on it, thank you. As more and more people read it and get their hands on it and like reach out like, "Oh, I love it." And I'm really looking forward to talking to people about it. For me, okay, got 2 minutes. Here we go. For me, the querying process. It was interesting. I lucked out because I did one of those Twitter chat things. So I did like Pit Mad, and basically you tweet out a summary of your book, and then any agents who are interested go ahead and like that tweet. So I had a few like it. The one who I ended up signing with, I remember I sent her my query. She was like, "Okay, send me like the materials." I sent her, I think, the first 100 pages, and she was reading it over a weekend on a Sunday. And I was in a show, and I was backstage in between scenes, and I saw an email from her, and she was like, "Hey, can you send me the full?" And I was like, "Bet, you got it." I keep it in a Dropbox on my phone, sent it out to her. And after the show, I was getting dinner, and she was like, "Hey, do you have time to hop on a call?" And I luckily found someone who was extremely passionate about the story. I lucked out to find also an editor who was extremely passionate and who loved Shakespeare. She went to Shakespeare camp. Right. So she was like in it to win it. But then I spoke to 2 editors. I spoke to another editor, and she was like, "Yeah, can you cut all the theater stuff out?" And I was like, "Girl, what?" Ma'am. So, you really, all you need, it's really hard, but all you need is one yes. All you need is that one yes, that one person who believes in you at every single level, and you are like set. That's it. Thankfully you don't need like, you need the people who are going to fight for your book, fight for your vision, fight for your art. You don't need a committee. You need one person who's going to fight hard. So it's rough. And it can be long. It can be short. It's a lot of hurry up and wait. But yeah, you just need one yes. Oh, yep. Now we're going to go sign books. So if y'all want book sign, we're going to be over in the book signing area. Thank y'all so much. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you so much.